Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third of our Thinking About lectures of this term. It is a pleasure for me to welcome an international conductor and a very esteemed colleague and friend, Neil Thomson, who is joining us from Brazil. Hello, Neil. How are you?
I'm fine, Luis. It's nice to be here.
Welcome, and thank you to everyone who is joining us from the SSLP and also from the Bristol Partnership today. We will be talking today about Beethoven, celebrating Beethoven's 250th anniversary. We started with some wonderful events at the beginning of the year, which sadly were interrupted with all the lockdown, but we are really delighted to be able to put this lecture together, as well as a second lecture later this week on GCSE set work, the Pathetic Sonata. So, but without further ado, I would like to introduce everyone to Nick from Dulwich College and Felix from the Elmgreen School, who will be taking over this interview with Neil. It will be a fascinating interview talking about Neil's career and his views and his love of the music of Beethoven, and you will be able to also listen to some excellent short clips of music chosen by Neil during this session. So enjoy, and over to you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. We're delighted to speak to you today and very much looking forward to discussing Beethoven, especially as Mr. Paris said, as we celebrate his 250th anniversary of his birth in 2020. But before we talk about this great composer, we would like to know a little bit about you and your career as a distinguished conductor and professor. I think I'd also like to mention there'll be a live Q&A session running throughout this webinar. So if anyone out there would like to submit a question, just submit it in the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and we'll try and get to your questions. So the first question we have for you, Neil, is where and when did it all start, and when did you decide to become a conductor instead of an instrumentalist?
Well, I think I can honestly say it all started in Dulwich. Before I went to the college, I was at Dulwich Prep, and I started playing the violin when I was 7. And I think at about the age of 12, I just knew I wanted to be a conductor. And when I arrived at the college, there was a marvelous head of music called Alan Morgan. I mean, the music department is wonderful. It still is, I know. But and he and the head of strings, David Price, really encouraged me in my desire to be a conductor. And so when I was 14, I put on a charity concert for the local Cheshire Home. We used to, I don't know if you still do it, we used to go there on field day to do voluntary service. And I thought it would be a nice thing to do a concert to raise money for them in St. John's Church up on Norwood. And I got together some friends from school and some local amateurs and a couple of teachers. And I put on a concert, and I did the Gluck Overture to Orpheus, the Grieg Holberg Suite, and Beethoven's First Symphony. So Beethoven has been part of my musical makeup since those days. But it all started in Dulwich.
So we know you also studied with Norman Del Mar. What was that like?
That was one of the, I count myself extremely lucky to have had 2 years of Norman. He was not only a great conductor, he was a great intellect. As you know, he's written a lot of books on conducting Beethoven, conducting Brahms, The Anatomy of the Orchestra, which is really a sort of Bible for conductors. But what I learned from Del Mar was that in performance, you should never, ever be dull. He used to say, do whatever you want, but never be boring. And he had a very idiosyncratic way of conducting, which he, I think, rather emulated Sir Thomas Beecham. But always, he taught us that with our physical gestures, with the way we stand, the way we use our face, you have to embody the music. You have to inhabit the music. And that was really a fundamental lesson that I've taken with me all my life and that I use in my teaching. And I can honestly say there's not a lesson that I teach where I don't quote Norman Del Mar. He's someone who, I mean, he's been dead for 25 years, but I think about him every day.
And after leaving Dulwich College, I know you became the head of conducting at the Royal College of Music. Something I think lots of the people in the audience, especially those looking to study music at conservatoires, will be very interested in is, what did you do as head of conducting there, and what was that role like? Well,
my job actually was to specifically to redesign the postgraduate conducting course. Since after Norman Del Mar died, it had drifted a little bit. There was no real sort of clear curriculum. So that was my first job, was to restructure it. And the second part of my job was to be in charge of the orchestral training program. We used to have three orchestras there. And so part of my job was to help to program things, to conduct my own concerts, to prepare concerts for guest conductors. And in the end, we had, guest conductors like Bernard Haitink came in to do Mahler 2, Bruckner 7. So the two strands of my job, to look after the postgraduate platform, but also to be in charge of the orchestral training program. And I was there for, in the end, 14 years. I think I only left in 2006.
Cool. So after you left in 2006, you moved to Brazil and started working with the Goiás Philharmonic Orchestra. Could you tell us a bit more about this? How long have you been living?
Yeah, actually, Goiás was a little bit later. I had just, I don't know, maybe 8 years or so after I left the college as a freelance conductor, and I was traveling around and about conducting. Then in 2006, it was 2006 that I met a Brazilian conductor who lives in Goiás. He was taking part in a summer school that I was teaching. And he said to me, we must keep in touch. One day you must come to Goiânia. And I heard nothing until, I think, 2013. And he invited me to go and conduct the orchestra. The orchestra was a new orchestra. And it went well. And they invited me to be principal conductor. So since 2014, I've been chief conductor. And I've lived in Brazil now for just 3 years. Before that, I was living in Paris, so I was commuting back and forth from Brazil to Paris to Brazil. But now, the last few years, I live and work in Brazil.
Okay. Something I think lots of the members of the audience will be particularly interested in is there are a school of musicians who say that conductors are no longer necessary for performance. I personally don't believe this, but I know it is a big debate that often happens within large music groups. So one question that I'm very frequently asked in lots of my school ensembles as well is, what's the most important thing a conductor does, and why is a conductor still integral to the role of a performance?
I think that the most important thing that a good conductor can bring to an orchestra is a singular musical vision, a way of drawing together different possibilities, because there are different ways to play Beethoven 5, there are different ways to play, Tchaikovsky 5. But a good conductor will be able to focus the energy and the musicianship of the group in front of him, but to bring a singular musical vision. And of course, orchestras can play Beethoven 5 without a conductor, not a problem. But there are times when a conductor is useful. If you're playing in an acoustic which is very echoey, the musicians need you. So, and if you're doing a complicated contemporary piece, the musicians need you. I mean, there are experiments with orchestras that work without conductors. I think actually after the Russian Revolution, there was an orchestra that functioned in the Soviet Union, a full symphony orchestra, which had no conductor and everyone could contribute their own idea. And of course, after a few years, it just fizzled out, because if you've got 50 people contributing their own ideas to how they think Beethoven 5 should go, it normally ends up in conflict. So a conductor can be a force for good and also a force for bad, because a bad conductor can really affect the sound of the orchestra. It can impede the orchestra from playing together very well. But a good conductor should be able to bring all these things, to bring a singular musical vision and get the best playing out of the orchestra.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's very insightful. Just linking on to that, in the Q&A, Wayne has asked, what does conducting mean to you? So I thought that'd be interesting to find out.
For me, it's conducting is probably the last profession I should have chosen, because I'm fundamentally a shy person who doesn't like standing in front of groups. If I have to make a speech, I feel like I want, the earth can swallow me up. But when I'm conducting, it's the most natural form of self-expression. It's the easiest way in which I can express myself through music.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So while you're conducting, obviously you've talked about creating one vision of the music, but what is it most that you want from the musicians in your orchestra?
I think what you always want is that you want the maximum that they can give. This is one thing I learned from Bernstein. He always said you have to conduct every concert as if it's your last concert. It would be terrible to go out of life on a sort of mezzo forte. That was his thing. So what I want from the musicians is that they play with the maximum of commitment, of character, of color, of sound, so that you're living the performance. You're living the music. And that can be difficult sometimes, if an orchestra knows a piece very, very well, that can be a good thing, but it can also be a difficult thing for the conductor to change. No, that's what I would say to that.
Speaking of orchestras and playing, something I've often wondered about is, with instrumentalists, they're always practicing their music before a performance. And I've always wondered, do conductors practice conducting before a performance? Is there a way you sort of put on either a record and conduct along to a blank score, or how do you prepare for a performance?
Well, I can tell you how I taught at the Royal College. I would teach a one-to-one lesson. So it would be like giving a violin lesson, one-to-one. And the student would conduct in silence. Going on from what Norma Del Mar said, that every gesture that you give has to reflect what it is you want to hear from the orchestra. So, with a musician, with a student, I'll take maybe the introduction of a symphony, and we'll say, what sound do you want here? What character? What articulation? And then how can you then transfer that into your hands? Because I think one thing is clear: the purest form of communication between a conductor and an orchestra is when the conductor isn't talking. You know, it's that moment of when you're just making music together. And I think you have to develop a manual technique, which is a technique only to express a musical idea. So with my students, we look at the score, we say, what is the musical idea? What is the composer's intention? What are you trying to achieve here? And then how do you find a physical gesture to express that idea? So that's how I teach. And I think it's important, because I think that there are schools of conducting where people, they analyze every note, they can play every note on the piano, they can hear everything, but they're never taught how to give an upbeat, or they're never taught how to give an appropriate upbeat to get the sound that you want at this moment. So that means that in rehearsal, it can be difficult for musicians. One of the biggest complaints I get from my colleagues in orchestras is that they're constantly having to retranslate what they see in terms of body language and what the conductor's asking them to do. So if you're asking for something legato and your body language is jerky, it's possible, but it's difficult to ignore the guy who's being jerky in front of you. You know, if you're asking someone to play pianissimo, but the gesture of the conductor is enormous, it's possible, but it's counterinstinctive. So this is my view of conducting. And if I look at the conductors that I really admire, I look at someone like Bernard Haitink, who for me, although he's retired, he's still the greatest living conductor. And Haitink's technique is purely expressing music, you know, but in a way that is also clear. I think if you can be clear and expressive, that's what we're aiming for. I'm still aiming for this. This is my, you know, my goal every day.
Thank you for that. The next question is that your repertoire is very vast, and we were just wondering, how many works have you conducted and how often do you venture into new repertoire?
I've lost count. I mean, I've got a repertoire list on my website, but I've never actually counted the number of pieces. I'm naturally a curious person. I like finding new repertoire. I have done. This was one of the, you know, the great things being at Dulwich. You know, they had, I don't know what it was like. They had a very good collection of scores. The music department had a lot of LPs. So I was always listening, trying to find new repertoire. And every year, I'm learning new pieces. I find it very difficult to say no to somebody. If an orchestra manager says, "How would you like to come and do Tippett First Symphony?" And even if it's in the middle of a horribly busy period, I will say yes, because I think, well, maybe this is the only time I get to conduct Tippett 1. So I think constantly discovering new repertoire is very important. It keeps you alive as an artist. And that's the quality, I think, that marks out my best students: curiosity. A student who is curious will probably go on to do very well for themselves.
Thank you for that. We've got a question from one of the people watching, Oscar Collier. And his question is, what is your opinion on a keyboardist conducting from the piano or the harpsichord? Because I know that's a different method of conducting that you normally do.
Sure. No, I think it's wonderful. And I think orchestral musicians appreciate it, because it's often, you know, if you're conducting a Mozart piano concerto, really, the conductor has very little say. It's how when I do a Mozart piano concerto, it's almost impossible to rehearse before the soloist comes, because it really hangs on how the soloist is going to phrase. So I think that direct contact between the soloist and the orchestra is perfect. Then they can play like chamber music. And there are a lot of Baroque pieces. I mean, sometimes, you know, I've been asked to conduct Vivaldi 4 Seasons, and I won't do it now. There's no point. You know, there's no point. It's one superfluous person, because the real point of contact is between the soloist and the orchestra. It's different if you're doing Rachmaninoff Third Piano Concerto, which has many more ensemble problems. There's a lot more for the orchestra to do. It doesn't just depend on the pianist. No, but I like it. I think it can be, as I say, a very direct and natural way to make a communication between the soloist and the orchestra.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. Our next question is, are there any particularly memorable experiences from your conducting career that you'd like to share with us?
I think memorable, but also slightly bizarre. I think the strangest thing I ever did was conduct the New Year's Eve concert for the Sultan of Oman. He has a thing called the Royal Oman Symphony Orchestra, which is entirely made up of Omanis. The late Sultan, he died sadly a few months ago, and he was a great lover of classical music. And in his palace, he built a concert hall, which was like a miniature Albert Hall from the outside. And every year he had a New Year's Day concert for him and some guests. And so we in the orchestra, we went there, I think at about 10 o'clock at night, and we were on standby. And I think at about midnight, the word came that they've just finished coffee, they're on the way over. So we had to go onto the stage. And I was told it's very delicate that you can't show your back to the Sultan of Oman, which is difficult if you're conducting. So you have to walk on stage, make sure that you never turn your back to him. You can't bow too deeply. That might be taken as a confusion with the way that people bow in the mosque. So you're told to give a sort of Japanese half bow. You can't start the concert until he tells you to. Then you're allowed to turn around. And as soon as the music's finished, you have to turn around to face him again. But there was an audience of about 15 people. It was the Sultan, the King and Queen of Spain, King and Queen of Sweden, and some of his old SAS buddies from the time when he overthrew his father back in the 70s. It was a very strange, surreal experience, but wonderful.
So another question we have is, which composer's music is your favorite to perform or conduct, and why?
It's impossible to say. I mean, it sounds like a cliche and everyone says it, but if I'm conducting a Mozart symphony, then Mozart that week is my favorite composer. If I'm conducting a Haydn symphony, Haydn that day is my favorite composer. I think that I can honestly say that the composer who touches me more profoundly than almost any other is Elgar. There's something in this music that runs deep in the English psyche, and perhaps it's become more important to me now because I've lived outside the UK since 2003. Maybe my attachment to Elgar has become deeper, but there's something in this vein of English melancholy that really touches me profoundly.
Okay. So moving on to talking a little bit about Beethoven. Of course, it's his 250th, it would be his 250th birthday in 2020. So I know loads of musicians recognize Beethoven as one of the greatest, if not the greatest of all composers. And loads of people talk about how relevant his music is even today. So why, in your opinion, is he such a great composer, and why is his music still so relevant?
Well, I think that Beethoven was the man who opened the door to the Romantic and the modern era. What came after Beethoven came because of Beethoven. His language is like Shakespeare. It's universal. It's what Mahler said, that the symphony must contain everything. The symphony must reflect the world. It must contain everything. And Beethoven's music contains everything, from the deepest, profoundest tragedy to the highest exaltation, and with all the other shades of emotion within. And these are timeless values. These are timeless values. This is why Shakespeare is just as relevant today as Beethoven is. And he changed. I mean, if you think what he did, every genre, practically every genre that he worked with, he expanded the structural and emotional scope of it, from the symphony, the string quartet, the piano sonata, violin sonata. I mean, Mahler's Bruckner symphonies would not have been possible without Beethoven. Schubert 9, Berlioz. Mahler, the first movement of Mahler 3 could not be possible. It's 35 minutes, would not be possible without Beethoven 9. And I think that he gave permission to composers to break the rules. He allowed Boulez to exist, Schoenberg. And I think this is Beethoven's great universality. And he was the first artist really to to be put on a pedestal, you know? The great man, the great heroic, lone heroic revolutionary, the man who fought against insuperable odds against his deafness. Because if you think of it, Bach was a church organist, if you reduce it to that. He worked on Sundays and wrote cantatas. Haydn, and to a lesser extent, and Mozart were employees. They were court composers. Beethoven was the first person who put his genius on a pedestal above his donors. Of course, he needed sponsorship. But there's a letter he wrote to one of his donors. He said, there will be 1,000 princes, but there is only one Beethoven. You know, he was the first great man, self-consciously great man of classical music. But
yeah, so talking about how you said he's been built on a pedestal, I just think it's interesting, how do you as a conductor balance like your interpretation of his music and kind of more his original ideas, if that makes sense?
Well, I mean, a lot has been open to us, I think, in recent years with people like Harnoncourt, Roger Norrington, this what you call historically informed aspect, which has opened another dimension to the way we perform Beethoven, with greater, how can you say, fidelity to the scores, no reorchestration. I mean, when I was a student in the 80s, it was quite normal to have 4 flutes, 4 oboes, 8 horns, you know, playing a Beethoven symphony. But now people realize that if you take the care to balance it, to make sure that the individual lines come through, then you're finding you're sticking to Beethoven's original intention without changing anything. So I would say it's always with any sort of performing, it's a question of fidelity combined with imagination. You know, you have to be. It's the spirit and the letter of the score. And I think it's for sure, as a conductor, you have to put out of your mind all the great conductors who've gone before, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to do anything. If you just have to. It's the relationship between you and what you see and hear in the score, presented in a way that is truthful.
Yeah, thank you. Our next question is, if you had to recommend one piece by Beethoven to someone who had never listened to him before in their life, what would it be and why?
I think probably Beethoven 5. That sounds a little bit like a cliche, but it's got everything that would attract people to Beethoven. It was it's like the epitome of his heroic period. And you have everything from the strongest drama to the highest triumph, a sort of this marvelous passage going from the 3rd movement to the 4th movement, where you go from darkness to the most blinding light. I don't think that anyone who hears that piece could not be affected by it.
Thank you. Another one we'd like to know is his nine symphonies are right at the core of any conductor's repertoire. But we'd like to know, what do they represent in musical history, and has your interpretation of these works changed over time? And if so, how?
Well, I mean, in musical history, as I said, they are perhaps the 9 most important symphonies ever written. They changed what a symphony could be. That's what they mean. Beethoven was able to write these extraordinarily large symphonic canvases by his use of this idea of the germ motif. Always there's a rhythmic motif that he would use to create a unity through a movement, but also with an almost startling harmonic instability. That he takes you through all the sorts of different keys, but by doing this allows him to build big movements. 9 symphonies also. Bruckner wrote 9 symphonies. Mahler was so terrified of writing 9 symphonies that he would die, that he wrote Das Lied von der Erde before the 9th symphony, but eventually he had to write a 9th symphony. So it's clear that it's 9 symphonies is a very strong, a potent image for composers.
Talking about his 9 symphonies, we've got a question from Sophia. She asks, out of all of his 9 symphonies, which one has been your favorite to conduct?
Oh, It's difficult to say. I was thinking about this because, I mean, I adore conducting the Eroica, number 5, number 9. Number 8 is also a much underrated piece. But for all the drama of 5 and for all the magnitude of number 9, I wouldn't want to give up all the joyfulness of number 4. So I think it's what conductors always say, is it's whichever Beethoven symphony I'm conducting that week is my favorite. That's all you can say.
Yeah, on that topic, I think you have a music extract for us. But first, just before we play it, we'd like to hear what you think the Ninth Symphony means.
Well, it came out of Beethoven's revolutionary zeal, the post-French revolutionary zeal, and his hatred of tyranny and oppression, and a desire for a more fraternal and equal society. What it means to me is Beethoven 9, without Beethoven 9, I don't think Wagner could have written Das Rheingold. I don't think the Berlioz could have written the Symphonie Fantastique. Bruckner couldn't have existed. Schubert 9 couldn't have existed. Mahler couldn't have existed. So it stands as a work which is a testament to the human spirit. And this performance I've chosen by Furtwängler, I think Furtwängler probably was the greatest of all Beethoven conductors. He really understood the rhetoric and the internal compositional dynamic. Because Beethoven, this sort of music with the sense of continual development, as someone said, it's like philosophy. One thing logically leads to another thing, which leads to another thing, which leads to a climax. And Furtwängler understood this. But at the same time, he had a wonderful freedom, rhythmic freedom, his use of rubato and tempo fluctuation. He always got a beautiful sound from the orchestra. This performance I've chosen, it's the end of the movement. And on one hand, it's terrible. None of it's together. It's not very tidy in the way that you would get a modern performance. But my God, this is the spirit of Beethoven 9. And it has an extra dimension because this was the first concert done at Bayreuth at the Opera House after it was closed at the end of the war. And of course, the political connotations of Bayreuth during the war and with Wagner were very sensitive. So you feel that this is really, in 1951, a moment of maybe contrition, but also of resolution after this.
thanks for that extract. That was a very exciting piece of music. It sounds...
Yeah, I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it? You know, there you feel the titanic, Herculean force of Beethoven. And of course, as I said, it's none of it's particularly together, but my God, it's exciting, you know?
Yeah, there seems to be a feel of almost energy and almost chaotic, but in a kind of controlled way. And I feel like the energy is really captured there. Something that made me think about is there a difference between conducting Beethoven with young musicians and with a professional orchestra? Is there ever sort of a difference in energy and intensity when you're conducting with different groups, or does every sort of group mold to the same performance?
No, I think it is different. I mean, I think this is what I alluded to a little bit earlier, is that sometimes a professional orchestra, knowing a piece very, very well, it can be difficult to mold your own performance. With a young group, of course, you have technical issues, you know, to be able to play together, to be able to play in tune. But I think if you had enough rehearsal time to do Beethoven 5 with a youth orchestra and really to get them to play with the spirit that we've just heard, then I think that there's nothing better. And professional orchestras vary, you know. It depends on the day. You know, sometimes if you do an RPO date in Northampton and you've got Beethoven 5 and you've got a 3-hour rehearsal, you're not going to achieve very much. But for instance, with São Paulo Symphony Orchestra, you know, you have 3 or 4 days of rehearsal, and you can really build something, you know.
Also, how many times have you conducted Number 9? Because it sounds like the kind of piece that when you really know it well, you can have a lot of fun with conducting an ending like that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know I've done it many times, and it's a piece that I would recommend any young conductor when to do the Missa Solemnis, when to do this. And Giulini said, you must wait until these works come knocking on your door. And Rattle then went to Kurt Sanderling, great German conductor, asked him the same question. He said, oh, you need to do your first Beethoven 9 when you're 20. He said, because it will be terrible. And your first Beethoven 9 when you're 60 will be terrible. So, you know, it's better to do it sooner rather than later. Because as you can imagine, there's an awful lot to absorb and to internalize. Because conducting is not just about knowing the score or being able to communicate your ideas. It's how those ideas mature and change over the years to the point when you really have internalized a piece. And that takes a long time. But you're right, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to conduct this ending. It's you feel, but with Beethoven, I always feel this in these moments, you feel that you will explode, you know? The energy is so manic, bubbling up inside you. It's a wonderful feeling, and that is really something that you only get with Beethoven, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Just moving on from there, we were wondering, apart from his symphonies, what are your thoughts on his concertos and his opera? I think it's called Fidelio.
Fidelio is one of the great pieces. This wonderful hymn to freedom, you know. Beethoven hated this idea of tyranny, and it's one of the most moving operas I know. The concertos, the violin concerto has been part of my life. When I was a kid, I think we didn't have much classical music in the house, but my mother had 2 LPs. One was Beethoven 5, and the other was the Beethoven violin concerto. And that piece I've been in love with since I was 7 or 8. But what is extraordinary about the violin concerto in particular is that basically it's a symphony with violin obbligato. You know, it's not like a Mozart violin concerto, which is 25 minutes, very, very clear, formal structural patterns. But the Beethoven violin concerto is this enormous piece, enormously long first movement, which has symphonic. It's the same thing with the third, fourth, and fifth piano concertos. All have this. They're like symphonies, but with solo obbligato. No, for sure, Beethoven changed the parameters of what a concerto could be. in the same way that he changed the parameters of what a symphony can be. Oh, and I like the triple concerto as well. That's a piece that the received wisdom was that the triple concerto is not a very good piece, but I think it's a marvelous piece. I think the first movement is splendid.
Talking about Beethoven's pieces, we've got a question from Henry asking which Beethoven piece is your favorite and why?
It's difficult to say. I think that possibly it's the piece we're going to play next. It's the final string quartet, the F major string quartet, number 16. And I find it profoundly moving because he knew he was dying by then. He was already ill. And he'd written these mammoth string quartets, the big C sharp minor, the B flat major, the grosse Fuge. And this plays for 25 minutes. And it's almost Haydn-esque in its simplicity. But in the middle of it is this slow movement, D flat major, completely unrelated to the sort of brightness of F major. And he wrote it as a sort of song of calm or peace. And you feel that there's an acceptance that he knows his life is near an end, is coming to an end. And probably that's if I had to take a desert island piece, it would be that. This piece was overflowing with love. It's beautiful.
Well, yeah, that was very beautiful. I really like the kind of slow entrance into that. Our next question just moves on a bit. It's that there's a perceived divide between classical music and more often kind of more modern forms of music. And we were just wondering, why do you think classical music is often seen as elitist and exclusive?
Felix, I'm going to answer that straight away. But there was one thing actually that I wanted to say about that performance. Yeah. It's unusual because it's a string quartet but played by a full string orchestra with double basses in an arrangement that Leonard Bernstein made with the Vienna Philharmonic. He recorded that on the C-sharp minor quartet. And a lot of people, a lot of my chamber music friends think that it's an abomination that a string quartet should be played by a full string orchestra. But I think that despite its inauthenticity, for me, that performance is the most authentic Beethovenian performance I can think of. And I know that the Bernstein said this was the record that he was most proud of. It was the record that he was most proud of. So I would urge people to listen to the whole disc. It's wonderful. And, you know, just listen to the music and worry less about the format. Yeah, classical music being elitist, this is something that we have all over the world now. You know, this is something that's said. And I think that there are things only become elitist when you don't have access to them. And I think access to classical music, and I mean in schools, and I think that the easiest way to get people involved in classical music is to get them playing in an orchestra, you know, give them instruments. And I think that's the way that you normalize classical music, you know. The less contact that people have with instruments, with playing, the more elitist classical music seems. I'm an optimist. I don't think there's anything wrong with classical music. I think there's a lot wrong with the way that people try to present it. You know, you can't sell classical music as being something that it isn't. There's nothing wrong with it. It just has to be played well and presented in a way that can be interactive. But the most important thing is to get people playing, to get young people playing.
Thank you for that. Talking about getting young people into playing and performing music, what do you recommend to those students interested in learning how to conduct? What do you recommend they do to best pursue this?
The first thing I would say, this is not just to conductors, but to any musicians, is you have to listen to as much music as possible. I spent basically all my teenage years, basically when all my friends were going out to parties on Saturday night, I was sat at home trying to follow the score of Wozzeck or Stockhausen Gruppen or The Rite of Spring. So there's a lot you can do by listening. You have a lot of access to scores now on the internet, and you have something that with YouTube that you have that I didn't have when I was a student. You can watch conductors, you know? It's really important to watch as many conductors as possible. If you can, go to rehearsals. You need to find, everyone needs a teacher. You will need to find a teacher. I was lucky that when I was at school, there was something called, I don't know if it exists, the Dulwich Orchestral Society. It was an evening class orchestra that used to rehearse in Dulwich Village on Tuesday nights. And I went along to play. And the conductor there helped me a lot. And he started to give me some lessons. So it's important to find a teacher, to find someone who maybe conducts a local amateur orchestra, who conducts a local youth orchestra, but to listen and to watch videos. Watch as many conductors as you can, and watch also videos of rehearsals. That's very important, to see the real work of conducting, what goes on in a rehearsal.
So when you're teaching conducting, what's the number one thing you want your students to achieve? What's the number one thing you want to get across to them?
The number one thing I try to get across to them is that they have to develop a way of expressing musical ideas with their body language. So first of all, they have to have an idea. You know, that's the most important thing. So I work a lot on that. What is really the character of this? How does this work with the structure of the movement? What is the sound of this? And ultimately, as a conductor, you have to learn to be your own best teacher, because part of it is quite a lonely job. You travel around the world, you go to an orchestra, maybe they will engage with you, maybe not. The chances are that very often you won't have any social contact with people in the orchestra. You come, you do your rehearsal, you go. Maybe you see someone from the management, but then you go straight back to the hotel. And if things aren't working, if something isn't together, if you can't get a tempo that you want, you have to know enough about your technique to be able to analyze it and to correct it. In the same as a violin player, if something's not working, you need to know exactly how to fix it. So that's what I would say to my students. The first thing is that how to express the idea, and ultimately you have to learn enough about yourself and your technique to become your own best teacher.
Thank you for that. Our next question is from Christopher, And he asks, is the age of the autocrat conductor like Herbert von Karajan, I'm sorry, I ruined that, finished? And yeah, is that age finished?
I think so. I think that this is, this way of behaving is no longer acceptable. People, I think, have a healthier relationship to power, and an understanding of hierarchies. I mean, conductors now work in a much more collegiate way. And I think that Simon Rattle, who I absolutely adore, I think he's a wonderful conductor, by him being in Berlin, that sent very strong messages, you know? This collegiate way of working is the new normal. What I would say is I think that we need to be careful as conductors in that, not just to become cheerleaders, you know, making orchestras feel good about themselves. You have still to do the work. There's always technical nuts and bolts things that you have to fix as a conductor. And I think that's important. So collegiate, but like Rattle, never letting the standard drop.
We have another question from Christopher. He asks, why are there relatively few women conductors?
I think that's, first of all, I think that's something that's changing, which is great. I think it's being perceived, like a lot of jobs, as a male. It's something that only men do, and it's taken a little bit of time for people to realize that women can also do it. As in other jobs, you know, there would be a time when a woman it would have been impossible for a woman to have a big job in the city, you know? So little by little things changing. And I think that now is actually a very good moment for women conductors. I think now that you're seeing agents now are actively looking for women conductors. So I think now is a good moment. And to be honest, whenever I've had a female student, I'm never aware that I'm teaching a woman. You're just teaching a musician. And I think that eventually this distinction will, you know, you will just have conductors, good conductors and bad conductors, you know?
Speaking of conductors and getting into the career path of being a conductor, we have a question from Sophia, and she asks, how do you get into conducting as a career, and is there a specific route?
There's no one specific route, but I think it's certainly not as easy as it used to be. Certainly, you know, going to music college helps to study. You build a network of starting your own orchestra. That was certainly another way to do it. The other way, I guess, is to attach yourself to a famous conductor as an assistant and hope that they get sick one day and you have to jump in for them. Or winning competitions, or maybe getting to the finals of the competition. That maybe an agent or a conductor, even if you don't win the competition, they think, you know, I like this person, I think they will do something. In the States, because virtually every big orchestra has an assistant conductor, that's also another route. You know, if you get to be an assistant conductor with one of the big 5 orchestras, when one of the sort of C-grade orchestras are looking for a music director, that puts you in the top percentage to be at least selected for audition. So basically those are the way, and then you need an awful lot of luck as well. You know, I think there's never been a time in history where more people have wanted to be conductors. Even in the 80s, when I was a student at the academy, you couldn't study conducting everywhere. But now, I mean, virtually every university has some sort of conducting.
Yeah.
The world is full of people who want to be conductors.
Thank you. The next question is, are you optimistic about the current COVID-19 situation, and how through that can we keep music relevant in our society?
Yeah, I mean, when I see what my colleagues are going through in the UK, it's very difficult to be cheerful. I mean, I know I have a lot of friends who've not received any money since March, who've had to resort to doing other jobs just to make ends meet. But I think, like everything, this will pass. There will be a vaccine. I don't know when it is. But one thing we've learned is that state support for the arts is really important. And the countries that are doing well are the countries that have state support. The countries that are just being kind of thrown to the market, like in America, some of these orchestras, like Nashville, Indianapolis, sort of good, solid B grade orchestras, no one knows whether they will reopen. You know, even the Metropolitan Opera is closed until June 2021. It's a paradox, because on the other hand, I think during the pandemic, people have turned more and more to the arts and to music. And I hope that when this is over, people can reflect on this at this moment where music and the arts were really important to people. The danger is, of course, is that a lot of musicians will be doing live streamings for free. And I think this is dangerous, because people have to understand that music shouldn't be for free.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even musicians have to eat.
Yeah, of course, I agree with that. Sadly, we are reaching the end of this interview, but before we finish, it'd be really great to ask you one final question, and that is, if there's one piece of advice you could give to the next generation of musicians, what would it be?
You need, well, apart from keep listening, never stop being curious, but also now we need to be adaptable and flexible as musicians. You know, that's historically, isn't it? Societies that survive crises are the ones that adapt. So keep listening and be adaptable. And 3, be nice, you know?
Yeah.
The world is small. I always say to my students, be nice. I think you know, that's those 3 things.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Mr. Thomson, for such an enlightening, inspirational conversation. It's really been great.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. You know, Dulwich gave me an awful lot as a musician, and I really think that I am a professional musician because of the nurturing that I had at school, and also not just musically, but intellectually. So I'm very happy to be back talking to you all.
Thank you so much. And of course, we'd love to come and see you conduct next time you're in London, so please let us know.
Will do.
Thank you. Thank you to the SSLP and of course Nick, who co-hosted this with me, our schools and everyone behind the scenes for making this webinar possible. Please do join us next week. Next week the webinar is titled Thinking About Black History Month, and we'll be talking to grime recording artist African Boy. So thank you everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Please have a good evening.
Thank you, Felix and Nick. Thank you.